The final section of our notes on the progressives. This is part 4. Again, remember you are taking Cornell notes. Your during notes are on the right-hand side. Your post notes in questions and big ideas are on the left-hand side. I will be looking for a one-sentence summary at the end of these notes. This is part 4 of our 4-part series of the progressive notes. This is going to be presidential action. We're going to look at Theodore Roosevelt, as well as W. Woodrow Wilson. Let's start off with Theodore Roosevelt. As you can see right here, Theodore Roosevelt is going to have a lot of political activism. So he's going to be poked fun of as a king, and that he's going to have a lot of authority during this time period, that a lot of authority was needed, but he's going to do it in the interest of the people. TR in the Modern Presidency. Theodore Roosevelt rejected the limited role of the 19th century presidents. He sought to broaden the executive power. He's going to do this by exerting legislative leadership, reorganizing the executive branch, and encouraging the development of a personal presidency. So really this modern presidency that we have is going to be birthed by Theodore Roosevelt. He's going to be a lot more personal. He's going to have a lot more authority. He's going to work a lot more with Congress and get Congress to get things done. Previous to this, during the 19th century, the 1800s, after the Civil War, presidents were generally more Republican, more status quo, conservative, and so he's going to have a more bold presidency, kind of a kingly presidency. The first big threat that took place was the United Mine Workers Union. They demanded higher wages, 8-hour workday, and union recognition. So they went on strike, which means that they stopped producing coal, which means that the nation started to not be able to heat themselves, not be able to stay warm. And so this is a very important strike that took place, a very important measure. And so what Theodore Roosevelt does is try to broker between them and the bosses that are paying these men. He's going to do this by declaring that this a national interest. So he's going to make the coal strike a national spotlight, something that's important for the government to get involved in. He believed that his role as president was to mediate between both parties, the coal miners and the owners of the coal mine, for the public good. He even actually threatened to use the army. He said that if a coal mining, if the coal miners were not able to reach a deal, that he was going to send in the army. He even said, to hell with the Constitution when the people want coal. So as you can see right here, Theodore Roosevelt is going to be a different type of president. He's going to be a president that is very bold. He's not going to be a constitutionalist. He's not going to be a conservative. He's going to be much of a progressive or a liberal, in that he wants to use big government in the interest of the people, which for his credit, you could see that big government was needed during this time period. Roosevelt's intervention, he set a precedent of government activism involved in this labor dispute. And so he actively gets involved in this labor dispute, which sets a precedent for later presidents to get involved in the economy, less of a laissez-faire capitalist approach. He would be known as a trust buster. He wanted the corporations to not be abusing the people and the consumers and the workers as they had for so long. So he's defunding the public. He wanted to regulate businesses. He didn't want to just take over businesses. So he wasn't a socialist. He didn't believe that the government should take over all businesses or even important businesses, but he did believe that the government had the responsibility to regulate. So with Roosevelt, you should know regulation. He's much of a trust buster. He wants to break up those trusts, break up those monopolists, and the abuses that the big corporations had. However, in the election of 1912, he's going to have to run against Woodrow Wilson. as well as another Republican candidate, William Howard Taft. And so he's going to end up second, but he is going to split the Republican vote, as we can see right here. Woodrow Wilson. So Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism. Roosevelt is emphasizing on a strong government to promote economic and social order for the entire nation. So he's a little bit more progressive, more liberal. Even though Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat, you have to remember the Democrats were originally very conservative, and so he wants more freedom. He wanted to minimize the government, whereas the Republican Theodore Roosevelt, he wanted to maximize the government. He wanted to limit the government to regulate competition. He also believed the government's role was to merely break up monopolies and remove tariffs. So he is going to want to lower tariffs so that companies can have worldwide understandings and worldwide trade and such. And so he's going to break up those tariffs and break up the monopolies. He wants less barriers to economic free enterprise. So ironically, during this time period, the Republican Roosevelt was more pro-government, and the liberal Woodrow Wilson was more anti-government, so to speak, or more freedoms. Woodrow Wilson, he initially is going to limit a lot of the progressive movement. He refuses to support women's suffrage, so he does not support female suffrage. He also will not support child labor laws, so he allows children to work. And he also will not take a stance on racial segregation. So African Americans are going to be very disheartened by his presidency. As you can see right here, The Birth of the Nation, that was the very first film created. It was a black and white film, no volume, because it was a silent film. It was actually a film about the KKK, the birth of America, and how the KKK is so important to protecting America's democracy and everything. And Woodrow Wilson actually praised this film. So as we can see right here, Woodrow Wilson really didn't have much of a concern for African Americans, as he is not a member of the KKK, but he is definitely supporting their agendas. He's going to create the 16th Amendment, which is the national income tax. This is going to allow the government to expand its activities. So an income tax means that previously to this, the government got their taxes through sales tax or through protective tariffs, which means when we buy from another country, those products are being taxed, whether it's from Britain, whether it's from China, those items are being taxed. He's going to lower those taxes, and he's going to make an income tax, which ends up actually targeting more of the rich. He wanted to balance the budget, and so he's somewhat of a conservative, wanted to balance the budget, but at the same time, he is expanding the government through the 16th Amendment. The IRS would be created as a result of the 16th Amendment. So really, Woodrow Wilson creates the IRS, the dreaded IRS that collects taxes today. The national income tax would be during Woodrow Wilson. He's also going to create the Underwood Simmons Tariff Act, which is going to lower tariff rates. So this is going to be the first time that tariff rates are really lowered, which means protective tariffs are taxes on goods that are bought overseas, and so he's going to expand trade that way. He's also going to create the Federal Reserve Act, which this is going to revise the banking system. It's going to allow the Federal Reserve Board, which is a private bank, not a federal bank, to be able to finance itself, and the dollars that we have today are going to be able to be funded through this Federal Reserve Act. So this is a banking currency act that extends the government's regulation of our currency. Then we have the Federal Trade Commission, which is the government agency to provide regulatory oversight over business activity. So again, he has not wanted to create too many government agencies, but he does want to oversight and to regulate, much as Theodore Roosevelt did, but in a more conservative manner. In conclusion, the progressive movement intends to change society, but actually does very little lasting change. There's a lot of agencies that are going to be created, but very true lasting change is going to happen. And that's because the progressives really kind of lose sight of this idea that man is sinful and that man's hearts cannot be reformed just through some laws. And so the heart was never changed in Americans, just a bunch of laws were created. The laws in the proactive presidency would have a long-term effect, though, that we start having more of a proactive president and more of a more government laws to protect society. So we do see a long-term effect here, but very few short-term effects. So make sure to review your notes, put the big ideas on the left-hand side of your notes, and make sure to have a one-sentence summary and be prepared to share that summary in class. Thank you for taking these notes.